New Glenn breathes fire for the first time, Chinese company CosmoLeap tests a pair of chopsticks, OneWeb counts down to the new year one day too early, Parker Solar Probe gets closer to the sun than ever, and SpaceX reveals details about the next generation of Starlink satellites. We'll have all that and a whole lot more this week in Spaceflight. Roscosmos announced that it plans to extend the duration of their Soyuz missions to the International Space Station. These missions usually last 6 months, but Roscosmos wants to extend them first to 7 and then later to 9 months. This should ultimately reduce the number of missions by 1 every 2 years. Unfortunately, no further information about these plans was released. Now, it's unclear if Soyuz needs any design or operational changes to support longer missions. Previously, the mission duration was limited by the capsule's hydrogen peroxide propellant. It can degrade over time, so performance was believed to be reduced too much if Soyuz time in space exceeded 6 months. It's possible that Roscosmos has made some changes to Soyuz, or perhaps discovered that degradation isn't actually as much as previously believed, but at this time, we simply don't know. It wasn't announced why Roscosmos wants to implement these changes, but the likely goal is to cut costs. The Russian space program has been underfunded for a long time, and the war in Ukraine hasn't made the financial situation any better. We also haven't heard whether NASA is on board with the plans. NASA has a deal with Roscosmos to fly astronauts on these missions, and cosmonauts also fly on Dragon in return, but it might not be an issue for NASA after all. In the last episode, we discussed a NASA strategy on how to sustain human presence in low Earth orbit after the ISS is decommissioned. This document emphasized the importance of long-duration space missions, and that missions shorter than 6 months have little value to the agency. So these longer Soyuz missions might actually be very useful to NASA. We still have yet to see which Soyuz mission will be the first to stay in space longer than we're used to, but you can be sure that we'll cover it in a future episode of This Week in Spaceflight. Don't forget to give us a like and subscribe so you don't miss all of the latest news and stories. There's one type of launch that we cover pretty much more than anything else: Starlink launches. With 89 Starlink launches in 2024, there was one nearly every week, and many weeks even had more than one. All of these launches meant that SpaceX made a lot of progress on its constellation this year, and at the end of the year, SpaceX shared a progress report. As expected, much of the report is SpaceX boasting that Starlink has connected remote communities all over the world to the internet. But the 63-page-long document also included some interesting technical details that we didn't know yet. So here's a quick overview of all of the new things that we learned. Starlink now has 4.6 million customers worldwide in 118 countries and territories on all continents. Yes, that even includes Antarctica, as the McMurdo Research Station is now connected through Starlink as well. SpaceX has also been rolling out Starlink's direct-to-cell capabilities to customers. We learned recently that the feature is now available to customers of the Ukrainian provider Kyivstar. All satellites that have been launched recently were Starlink V2 mini satellites. These are all smaller versions of the V2 satellites that SpaceX originally developed to launch on Starship. Now, since Starship isn't operational yet, SpaceX shrunk the satellite so it could also be launched on Falcon 9. That's how we got to the V2 Mini. And this year, SpaceX optimized the V2 Mini satellite even more. The latest version weighs about 575 kilograms at launch, which is nearly 22% lighter than the original. This reduction in mass now allows SpaceX to launch up to 29 satellites on a single flight, which is 6 more compared to the original satellites. However, we haven't seen SpaceX fill up a Falcon 9 like that just yet. Maybe 2025 will bring a Starlink launch at full capacity? We'll see. Another notable change SpaceX made to the satellites is a redesign of the solar arrays to minimize aerodynamic drag. Even though the Starlink satellites are in space, they still have to combat traces of atmosphere at the altitudes in which they operate. See, the atmosphere doesn't instantly go to a vacuum at the edge of space, but rather it gradually decreases over hundreds or even thousands of kilometers. These traces of atmosphere mean that satellites in low Earth orbit are slowed down by atmospheric drag and need to compensate by firing thrusters to maintain their altitude. The new solar arrays minimize this atmospheric drag, so the satellites are more efficient and can stay operational for longer. SpaceX is also working on the next generation of Starlink satellites, named V3. These satellites are designed to be launched on Starship and have a dramatic increase in performance compared to the previous version. We now know that the V2 minis had a capacity of 96 gigabits per second, which was already a lot more than the 24 gigabits per second of version 1.5. However, the V3 satellites will have a downlink capability of 1 terabit per second, which is over 10 times that of V2. What's more, the uplink capacity of V3 will be 24 times that of V2 with 160 gigabits per second. All of this means that a single Starship launch can add 60 terabits per second of capacity to the Starlink network. On all Starlink launches in 2024, SpaceX added roughly 300,000 gigabits per second to the network. By launching V3 satellites, Starship can do that in only 5 missions. With all of these planned improvements, it seems that Starlink will just keep growing and getting better and better. It was interesting to watch how quickly it developed from experimental to a mature service, and it seems like there is still a lot to look forward to. And now we'll take a glimpse at some other stories across space, starting with the Chinese company CosmoLeap, which has been testing its rocket catch tower. CosmoLeap plans to use this tower to catch its Yeqian or Leap rocket. The first variant of this methane-powered rocket is a medium lift launch vehicle that looks a lot like Falcon 9. It's supposed to fly for the first time in 2026, and a few weeks ago, CosmoLeap announced that it had completed a preliminary design review. The company is also planning a much bigger variant, slated to fly for the first time in 2030, and for that one, it looks like CosmoLeap took some inspiration from Starship and New Glenn. Seemingly, Starship also inspired the company for its booster recovery mechanism, as CosmoLeap is building a tower with chopsticks to catch its rocket boosters. Proving that their plans are not just renders, CosmoLeap has actually built a prototype tower already, and recently, they've been putting it through its paces with load tests and simulations. According to CosmoLeap, the system performed as expected. The company also released a photo of people standing on the structure, which revealed that it's tiny in comparison to SpaceX's Mechazilla. Nevertheless, we're looking forward to seeing CosmoLeap try to catch a rocket with it. It seems like the OneWeb internet constellation took a break to celebrate New Year's Eve. At midnight UTC on December 31st, so 24 hours before 2024 ended, the service went down in a global outage. It took engineers at OneWeb's owner Eutelsat 48 hours to bring back the service. According to Eutelsat, a software issue within the ground systems caused the outage. Later reports say that the software failed to account for the fact that 2024 was a leap year, so essentially the system thought that 2024 had ended exactly 24 hours too soon. This likely caused some systems to crash or misbehave, and OneWeb went down. According to Eutelsat, the company was fully mobilized to fix the issue, so its engineers probably didn't have the New Year's Eve that they expected, but fortunately for them, there's still some time to fix the issue before the next leap year comes around. The European Space Agency and Canadian satellite communications company Telesat have tested a 5G connection between low Earth orbit and the ground. ESA's 5G 6G laboratory at European Space Research and Technology Center, or ESTEC, in the Netherlands, connected with Telesat's LEO 3 demonstration satellite. According to ESA, this was the first time a 5G non-terrestrial network connection was used to communicate with a satellite in low Earth orbit. Previously, this was only done with satellites in geostationary orbits, but those don't move with respect to a user on the ground. Satellites in low Earth orbit move very quickly compared to the surface, so that's an additional challenge when connecting to the satellite. Like Starlink's direct-to-cell functionality, devices don't need additional hardware to connect with this non-terrestrial 5G network. This opens up a number of possibilities to connect people in remote areas or when regular infrastructure is impacted by disasters. NASA is expanding its Near Space Network, a network that allows the agency to communicate with missions up to 2 million kilometers away. That's much further than the moon, but still nearby in astronomical terms. NASA uses the network and its Tracking Data and Relay Satellite System, or TDRS, to communicate with spacecraft like Hubble and the ISS. NASA wants to extend the network's commercial capabilities, so the agency has recently contracted 4 companies to get involved. Specifically, the companies are going to add direct-to-Earth capabilities to allow spacecraft to send their data directly to ground stations on Earth. In other words, the companies will likely add more and better ground stations to the network. The contracts totaled $4.82 billion and were awarded to Intuitive Machines, SSC Space US, Viasat, and the Norwegian company Kongsberg Satellite Services. Their projects will start as soon as February and last until September of 2029, although NASA has an option to extend the contracts for 5 more years. With the network expansion, NASA hopes to support its Artemis campaign and science missions in various orbits. The new addition should also alleviate NASA's Deep Space Network for missions to the Moon and highly elliptical orbits. Blue Origin is getting ready for New Glenn's first flight, and it ended the year with ticking off the last important milestone, a hot fire of the rocket's first stage. During a hot fire, or static fire as we often call it, the rocket fires up its engines without the intention of lifting off. Now, we've been watching Blue Origin prepare for this test for a while now, and a few times they got really close, but not quite there. However, December 27th was finally the day. New Glenn fired up its 7 BE-4 first-stage engines for the first time. The hot fire lasted a total of 24 seconds, and for 13 of those, the engines fired at 100% thrust. This test also was the first time that Blue Origin operated the entire rocket for its first flight as an integrated system. The company loaded both stages with their respective propellants and tested all procedures leading up to the launch. According to Blue, the test campaign met all of its objectives. Just before the static fire, the Federal Aviation Administration granted Blue Origin its launch license, so now Blue is finally preparing for that all-important first launch. But more about that later in this episode. If you want to learn more about New Glenn and its upcoming first flight, we just published a video this week discussing all of that and more. Check it out! Now let's take a look at the space traffic for the end of the year and see what's coming up next week in spaceflight. Starting off the last week of 2024, we had an Electron rocket launching from Rocket Lab's launch complex in New Zealand. The rocket lifted off on December 21st at 1417 UTC, carrying another Strix satellite for Synspective into a sun-synchronous orbit. The mission, called Owl the Way Up, is the 6th out of 16 that Synspective has booked to fly on Rocket Lab's Electron rocket. Synspective's Strix satellites are synthetic aperture radar satellites designed to deliver imagery capable of detecting millimeter-level changes to the Earth's surface from space. After Electron, we had a Falcon 9 launch from Launch Complex 39A in Florida. Liftoff took place on December 23rd at 5:35 UTC, carrying a batch of Starlink satellites into low Earth orbit. This batch consisted of 8 Starlink V2 Mini and 13 Starlink direct-to-cell satellites. The booster for this mission, B1080, was flying for a 14th time, and it successfully landed on SpaceX's drone ship Just Read the Instructions. And while many were preparing for the holidays, NASA's Parker Solar Probe made its closest ever approach to the Sun. On December 24th at 11:53 UTC, the Parker Solar Probe spacecraft came within 6.1 million kilometers of the Sun, swooping by it at about 192 kilometers per second. During that historic pass, it came closer to the Sun than any other spacecraft before it and collected large amounts of data about the Sun's corona. The Parker Solar Probe arrived there after 7 flybys of Venus, which effectively reduced the spacecraft's distance from the Sun on each pass. That last pass, performed in November of last year, brought it to the closest that it will ever get, facing temperatures of up to 980 degrees Celsius. While in this orbit, the Parker Solar Probe will once again come close to the Sun on March 22nd and on June 19th, collecting more data about our star's corona and its dynamics. These, however, will be among the last few close swings that the probe will make around the Sun. The spacecraft has been operating in space for over 6 years, consuming its fuel to operate its attitude control system, which means that at some point it won't be able to point itself to transmit data to Earth or keep its heat shield facing the Sun for protection at close approaches. But NASA has a really interesting plan for when that time comes. Once the Parker Solar Probe is low on fuel, the agency plans to turn it around, exposing its instruments to the full blast of the Sun, and conduct one last data gathering before it melts away and vaporizes around the Sun. Coming back down to Earth, we had a milestone launch out of Kazakhstan. Liftoff of the Soyuz 2.1B happened on December 25th at 7:45 UTC from Site 31-6 at the Baikonur Cosmodrome. The rocket was carrying the Resource P No. 5 spacecraft into a sun-synchronous orbit. The Resource P satellites are a constellation of Russian Earth observation satellites capable of high-resolution imagery in multiple wavelengths. This was the 5th of those after the first 3, launched between 2013 and 2016, malfunctioned in orbit. But this launch wasn't even notable for the payload itself, rather because of the rocket. This was the 2,000th launch of any rocket derived from the R-7 intercontinental ballistic missile that the Soviet Union developed in the 1950s. Members of this family were famously named after the first payload that they launched, so they have names like Sputnik, Vostok, Voskhod, Molniya, Luna, and of course, the most famous of them, the Soyuz rocket. There were other lesser-known ones as well, but if we were to add up all of the launches that they've made, this one was the 2,000th launch. In fact, Roscosmos added a sticker to the rocket to make note of this, and even made infographics on the launches that make up that 2,000 number. It'll be interesting to see whether any other rocket family will ever come close to this number in the near future. Up next, we go to China, where unfortunately we had another launch failure, this time with a Kinetica 1 rocket. Liftoff took place on December 27th at 1:03 UTC from Site 130 at the Zhochuan Satellite Launch Center. The rocket was carrying the Deer-3 research platform and 10 other rideshares into a sun-synchronous orbit. The 11 payloads, however, never made it there. CAS Space, the launch operator of the rocket, confirmed on social media shortly after launch that the rocket suffered an issue with its third stage, resulting in a launch failure. According to the company, preliminary results show that the third stage lost attitude control 3 seconds into its burn, triggering the self-destruct system. The mission was the 6th launch of the Kinetica 1 rocket, the 4th of the year, and its first failure overall. The company was aiming to ramp up production and launch cadence of this rocket, targeting 8 launches of the Kinetica 1 rocket in 2025, with the goal of debuting a new and larger rocket, the Kinetica 2, also in 2025. But safe to say, those plans may now have to change in light of this failure. Coming back to the US, we had 2 back-to-back launches of Falcon 9 rockets. The first took place from a foggy Vandenberg in California on December 29th at 1:58 UTC. The mission was carrying a batch of Starlink V2 mini satellites into low Earth orbit as part of the Starlink Group 11-3 mission. The booster for this mission, B-1075, was flying for a 16th time, and it successfully landed on SpaceX's drone ship Of Course I Still Love You. Just a few hours later, from humid Florida, we got another Falcon 9 launch, and this one had no Starlinks. Liftoff happened on December 29th at 5 o'clock UTC from Space Launch Complex 40, carrying 4 Astranis satellites into geosynchronous transfer orbit. The mission, nicknamed From One to Many, was the first dedicated launch of Astranis satellites on a Falcon 9 rocket. These satellites are based on the company's micro-geo satellite bus, which has a mass of roughly 400 kilograms and dimensions of roughly 1 meter by 1 meter by 1 meter. These are a departure from the typical geo satellite, which is often several tons in mass, the size of a school bus, and needs a rocket like Falcon 9 all by itself. Those kinds of satellites often cover entire continents, or maybe half of one and half of another, but Astranis' micro-geo satellite bus is intended for a more localized market, and it's tailored for the needs of the region that they're going to cover. The mission name, From One to Many, is a reference to the satellite that Astranis already has in orbit, which launched last year as a rideshare on a Falcon Heavy mission. The company hopes to launch many more of these smaller satellites into GEO in the future, therefore going from one to many. The booster for this mission, B-1083, was flying for a 7th time, and it successfully landed on SpaceX's drone ship, a shortfall of Gravitas. However, this wasn't the booster originally intended for this mission. During the first launch attempt on December 21st, there was an abort at engine ignition, something that happened with booster B-1077. The booster was replaced by B-1083, which flew in its stead so the mission could still launch relatively quickly. The penultimate launch of the year took place from India with a PSLV rocket lifting off on December 30th at 16:30 UTC. The payload for this launch was SpadeX, which stands for Space Docking Experiment, and it was inserted into a low Earth orbit. The SpadeX payload consists of 2 nearly identical satellites fitted with rendezvous and docking mechanisms to test these systems in orbit. One of the satellites, called the Chaser, will approach another satellite, the Target, and will try to dock to it while in orbit. Once docked, the mission will also aim to perform secondary test objectives like transfer of power between the spacecraft or joint operations in orbit. This test mission is key for India to be able to rehearse and gain experience with docking spacecraft while in orbit, something that only Russia, the United States, and China have been able to do thus far. This type of technology will be important for the country's future ambitions, as India is aiming to launch its own space station into orbit by the end of the decade and will need on-orbit rendezvous and docking to assemble it in space. Its upcoming human spaceflight capsule, Gaganyaan, will also need to rendezvous and dock with that station as well. The country is also targeting a lunar sample return mission, Chandrayaan-4, later this decade, which will need multiple encounters and dockings while in different orbits around the Earth and the Moon. Ultimately, India wants to land its own astronauts on the lunar surface by 2040, so the hope is that all of this new knowledge will help to bolster them towards that goal. And to wrap up the year, we had, of course, a Starlink. It's always the ones you least expect, right? Liftoff took place on December 31st at 5:39 UTC from Launch Complex 39A in Florida. The mission was carrying 8 Starlink V2 Mini and 13 Starlink direct-to-cell satellites into low Earth orbit. The first stage, B-1078, was flying for a 16th time, and it successfully landed on SpaceX's drone ship. Just read the instructions. With the Starlink launches this week, the total tally of Starlink satellites launched goes up to 7,632 since the first one back in 2019. Of all of these, 737 have re-entered, and 6,176 satellites have moved into their operational orbit. That Starlink launch was the 259th and last launch of 2024. This is up from the 221 launches that we had in 2023, all thanks to SpaceX's record-breaking cadence. In fact, SpaceX performed so many launches this year that if you add up all of the launches from everyone else in the world, they still don't surpass the number that SpaceX carried out. And they did it despite suffering 3 mishaps to its Falcon family of rockets, one on launch, another at landing, and a third one during second stage disposal. And the amazing thing is that they're aiming for even more launches in 2025 of both Falcon and Starship rockets. Amazingly, unlike last year, no launches have taken place so far in 2025, at least as of the time of recording. That may change soon though, with the launch of a Falcon 9 carrying the Thuraya 4 NGS satellite into a geosynchronous transfer orbit from Florida. The 4-hour launch window is set to open on January 4th at 1:27 UTC. If schedules hold, another Starlink launch could take place from Space Launch Complex 40. The 4-hour launch window for that one would open on January 6th, but at 16:44 UTC. After, we'll have, of course, another Falcon 9 launch, this time from Launch Complex 39A, carrying a batch of Starlink satellites into orbit. Also next week, we may finally see the first launch of Blue Origin's New Glenn rocket. With its pre-launch static fire test now complete, everything is being readied for that launch. The rocket went horizontal, rolled back into its hangar, and it should have received its Blue Ring Pathfinder payload by now, assuming all went well, of course. Jacqueline, the landing barge for New Glenn, also departed Port Canaveral just yesterday and is on its way to the landing zone located approximately 620 kilometers downrange. Hazard notices are also starting to come out, and all point to a potential launch as early as January 8th within a 3-hour window that opens at 6 o'clock UTC. Next week, in deep space, we'll also have the 6th and final flyby of Mercury by the Bepi Colombo spacecraft. This flyby will see the spacecraft pass as close as 345 kilometers from the surface of the planet. This will alter its orbit enough to bring it back for another encounter in November of 2026, when the spacecraft will enter orbit around Mercury and begin its science operations. Coming back to Earth, we'll have another couple of Falcon 9 launches near the end of the week. The first of those will be the launch of the NROL-153 mission carrying a batch of Starshield satellites for the National Reconnaissance Office. The 1.5-hour launch window is set to open on January 10th at 3:19 UTC. The second launch will be a Starlink launch from Florida, which is planned to take place within a 4-hour launch window that opens on January 10th at 15:27 UTC. And another big launch that will take place next week will be of Starship. And I said big in the literal sense because it is, of course, the biggest rocket in the world, and in fact, it's going to be even bigger than it was the last few flights. That's because this will be the first launch of a Block 2 ship, which means that this Starship rocket will be 1.8 meters taller than 5 of the 6 previous Starships. This will be the 7th launch of Starship, and according to hazard notices for this mission, it appears that it'll be another afternoon one, with the launch window opening on January 10th at 2200 UTC. And that's your weekly update of spaceflight news. I'm Elysia Segal for NSF, and I'll see you all again next week to recap this week in spaceflight.